I'd like to talk a little bit about your book. In Yoga Body, discuss the origins of the modern postural practice that most people associate yoga with today. Can you tell us what you found in your research?
Sure. I'll say first that I now very much dislike the subtitle of the book, Yoga Body, which is the origins of modern posture practice, and wish I'd stuck with the earlier version, which was context of postural yoga practice in the modern age. Because it seems to me what I'm doing in the book is really describing contexts among other contexts rather than describing origins, even though we have many beginnings that I describe in the book. The basic thesis is, in my opinion, not a controversial one, although it's apparently caused some controversy, that yoga adapts and changes.
That's often a good thing, by the way.
What's that? Controversy?
Yeah, it's a good sign that you're probably doing something right.
I hope so, as long as nobody shoots me. But where was I? The basic premise is that yoga adapts and changes through time and has always done so throughout their tradition from many thousands of years. That's why it's so difficult to talk about yoga and know exactly what you're talking about, or to be sure that the person you're talking to is on the same page. However, that kind of development happened within a container that overflowed and received new input over the years from different regions, from different cultures. But it was in the late 19th century and into the 20th century that things started to change at a much more rapid pace, with a kind of globalization of the kind that we know today, and an increase in the speed at which information and ease at which information and people could travel around the globe. And yoga kind of broke its banks, possibly starting with Swami Vivekananda, who traveled to America to speak at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, and began then promoting this yoga as a practice. And set the ball rolling on a kind of a revolution in practice. Americans and Europeans started to think of yoga not as something that you would just look at or hear about, but that you would actually do for your own good, for your spiritual betterment, or even physical health. One of the odd things about this revolution, as I saw it in the early days, that's to say, for the first few decades of this introduction of yoga to the West, was that it was largely devoid of the element that is most popularly associated with the word yoga today, globally speaking, and that's to say posture practice, asana practice. And I think there's various reasons for this. One of them, I think, is that asana had a bad rap. It was associated with the Hatha Yoga, and these figures had been long seen, both within India and from sort of the external gaze of the colonizing gaze. Hatha Yogins had been seen as backwards, uncivilized, sort of black magicians, the kind of people that you didn't want to be associated with if you were a respectable modern person. And Vivekananda speaks very openly and fairly frequently about Hatha Yoga and Hatha Yogins, and sort of says, we have nothing to do with that here. You know, you can do a little bit of neti if you want. You know, you can wash out your nose if you have a cold. That'll help. But, you know, forget all this other stuff, this queer gymnastics and breathing exercises of the Hatha Yogins. So
can I ask you what did Vivekananda's yoga look like then? What was he practicing?
Oh, well, that's a really good question, because paradoxically, in spite of the anti-Hatha Yoga rhetoric, if you look at Raja Yoga, and you can find it online, I think at the Ramakrishna website, they have the full text for download. He's talking about, in the first part of the text, he's talking about, he's promoting a kind of manifesto of what you might call secular humanism. He's talking about the betterment of the human being. He's bringing in all sorts of references to the kinds of things that he was finding in America at the time, like, for instance, Christian Science of Mary Baker Eddy, or is it Mary Eddy Baker? I always get confused. Like Del Sartre, a kind of physical voice drama system. You know, he's sort of bringing all these things together to explain what yoga is. Then he goes on to talk about the various techniques. And surprisingly, the main thing that he's doing is describing Kundalini Yoga. He's describing what is essentially at the base of all Hatha Yoga practices. So he's smuggling it in a way that he couldn't do explicitly or openly, I think. But it remains, I think, it remains a practice of Kundalini Yoga, not to be confused with the modern system Kundalini Yoga of Yogi Bhajan.
Okay.
So that's what he's doing, but still there's no asanas, and that's no surprise, because I think in the kinds of traditions and texts that he's looking at, the asanas don't feature quite so in the same mode as we know them today, or quite so strongly. There's asanas there, but they're not they're not the same thing, I would argue. So what I do in the remainder of the book is really to see how asana made a comeback into the scene of globalized modern yoga. And in brief, well, there are several sources here. One of them is obviously the Hatha Yoga tradition and yoga traditions where asana is used. Mm-hmm. The other ones are things like gymnastics, things like curative medical gymnastics that come out of the European, a certain European tradition that got into full swing with a man called P.H. Ling, which interestingly itself has a kind of complex history that folds back into itself. And so Ling traveled to China and apparently gathered was inspired by a kind of Chinese medical gymnastics. So you have this process of ongoing globalization where there's never a single origin or source, and that's why I don't like the subtitle of the book, really, because there never is an origin, but there are multiple kind of confluences. Ling was one of them, and a kind of masculine culture of bodybuilding, physical culture that swept Europe in the 19th century is another one that had a sort of profound influence on the way that posture practice developed, particularly in India, prior to being then sort of exported to the West. Although, those similar kinds of experiments were also going on in the West. So, it's never a question simply of one person inventing or innovating. And there are lots of other influences, say, for instance, Freudian psychoanalysis. And as it was developed by Wilhelm Reich, so a kind of psychologized vision of the body that I think has played a very, very important role and continues to do so in the way that the body is conceived within popular postural yoga practice, and that's a difficult term. There's obviously a lot of variation, and I'm generalizing, but that kind of the kind of psychologization of the body as the repository of emotions, I think is a discourse that maybe a lot of people will recognize, that, oh yes, I store this particular kind of motion in my hip. If I do this kind of posture, say, the Ekapada Rajkapotasana, then I'll get this opening in my hip, and this emotion will be released. And in that way, by practicing yoga like this, I'll be able to remove the body armor that's repressed or stored, and so on. So that's another source of the development of modern posture practice, and there are many others.